Tears fell onto the cold Carrara marble of the most dangerous man in New York's kitchen. She tried to muffle her sobs, scrubbing frantically. Then the heavy oak door clicked shut. The lock turned. The city's ruthless syndicate boss stepped closer, his voice deadly soft. "Who touched you?" The penthouse on Franklin Street in Tribeca was a fortress suspended in the sky. For Sophie Harding, it was supposed to be just another Tuesday assignment for Elite Cleans, an upscale domestic agency that catered to clients who paid exorbitant fees in exchange for absolute discretion. The agency's golden rule was simple: see nothing, hear nothing, and never, ever speak to the homeowner unless spoken to first. Sophie had never met the owner of the Franklin Street penthouse, but the whispers in the agency break room painted a terrifying picture. His name was Elias Romano. The FBI called him a person of interest in their organized crime division. The streets of New York just called him the boss. He was the heir to a sprawling logistics and shipping empire that moved a lot more than just imported olive oil and high-end textiles through the ports of Brooklyn. Under normal circumstances, Sophie would have been terrified to breathe too loudly in Elias Romano's home. But today, terror had been entirely replaced by a bone-deep, crushing despair. Her ribs ached with a sharp, stabbing pain every time she inhaled. The left side of her face throbbed, heavily concealed beneath thick layers of cheap drugstore foundation that did little to hide the swelling near her cheekbone. Her hands trembled as she gripped the rough sponge, scrubbing furiously at a faint, dark stain on the pristine kitchen island. She didn't want to know what the stain was. She just needed it gone before her shift ended. But as she scrubbed, the dam she had carefully built inside her mind began to fracture. She thought about the eviction notice taped to her apartment door in Queens. She thought about the $15,000 she owed. Mostly, she thought about Dominic. Dominic, her ex-boyfriend, who had shown up at her apartment at 3 a.m. the night before, reeking of cheap bourbon and desperation. Dominic had a gambling problem, a sickness that had led him to borrow money from men who didn't send collection letters, but enforcers. And when he couldn't pay them, he came to Sophie. When she told him she was completely broke, he hadn't believed her. The backhand across her face had sent her crashing into the coffee table. "You better find the cash by Friday, Soph, or they aren't just coming for me," he had snarled, wiping his knuckles before walking out into the night. A choked sob ripped from her throat. Sophie pressed the heel of her rubber-gloved hand against her eyes, trying to stem the tide. But the tears came faster now, hot and humiliating. She leaned over the kitchen sink, her shoulders shaking violently as she wept into the empty, silent cavern of the multi-million-dollar kitchen. The state-of-the-art Sub-Zero refrigerator hummed quietly, indifferent to her breaking world. She was so consumed by the sheer panic of her reality that she didn't hear the private elevator ding. She didn't hear the heavy thud of Italian leather shoes against the wide plank hardwood floors. She only realized she was no longer alone when the massive, soundproof double doors of the kitchen swung shut. The heavy click of the deadbolt sliding into place sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. Sophie gasped, spinning around so fast she slipped on the polished floor, catching herself hard against the edge of the marble island. Standing by the locked doors was Elias Romano. He was out of his suit jacket, the sleeves of his crisp, white Tom Ford dress shirt rolled up to his forearms, revealing the dark, intricate ink that crept up toward his elbows. He was younger than the rumors made him out to be, mid-30s perhaps, with sharp, aristocratic features and dark eyes that absorbed the light rather than reflecting it. He held a crystal tumbler of amber liquid in one hand, the other resting loosely on the brass lock he had just turned. For a long, agonizing second, neither of them moved. Sophie's heart hammered against her bruised ribs like a trapped bird. She had broken the golden rule. She was crying hysterically in the sanctuary of a man who commanded an army of killers. I'm so sorry, Mr. Romano, Sophie stammered, frantically wiping at her wet face, inadvertently smearing the foundation and exposing the angry, purple-yellow bruise blooming on her cheek. I didn't hear you come in. I'm finishing the kitchen right now. I'll be out of your way in 2 minutes. She scrambled to grab her cleaning caddy, her hands shaking so badly that a bottle of glass cleaner clattered noisily onto the floor. Elias didn't blink. He didn't yell. He just took a slow, deliberate sip of his scotch, his dark eyes locking onto her face like a predator analyzing wounded prey. Leave the bottle, Elias said. His voice was a low, gravelly baritone that vibrated through the floorboards. It wasn't a request. It was an absolute command. Sophie froze, her hand hovering inches from the fallen plastic bottle. She slowly straightened up, her breath hitching. Elias set his glass down on the nearest counter with a soft clink. He took a step towards her. The sheer physical presence of the man was suffocating. He moved with a terrifying, calculated grace, closing the distance between them until he was standing just on the other side of the kitchen island. He tilted his head, his gaze intensely focused on the left side of her face. The silence stretched, heavy and dangerous, pressing against Sophie's eardrums until she felt dizzy. Who? Elias asked, his voice dropping an octave. Did that to your face? Nobody, Sophie blurted out instantly, her survival instincts overriding her common sense. It was an accident. I was rushing to catch the G train this morning, and I tripped on the subway stairs. I'm clumsy. I'm really sorry for crying. I just... Stop lying to me, Elias interrupted smoothly. He didn't raise his voice, but the sudden chill in the room was palpable. A fall on concrete leaves abrasions, scrapes. That is a blunt force contusion. Someone hit you. A man with a large hand, judging by the radius of the bruising. Sophie's mouth went dry. She gripped the edge of the marble island, feeling the room tilt. Mr. Romano, please. It's personal. I don't want to bring my problems into your home. If you're going to call the agency and have me fired, please just let me get my things. Elias walked around the island. Sophie instinctively took a step back, hitting the edge of the sink. She was trapped. He stopped less than 2 feet away from her. Up close, she could smell the expensive cedarwood cologne mixed with the faint, metallic scent of the city streets. He raised a hand. Sophie flinched violently, closing her eyes and turning her head away, bracing for an impact that never came. Instead, she felt the agonizingly gentle brush of his knuckles against her uninjured cheek. His fingers were calloused, warm, and surprisingly steady. He tilted her chin forward, forcing her to look up at him. "I am not going to fire you, Sophie," Elias said softly, reading the name tag stitched onto her grey uniform. "And I am not going to hurt you. But I am the kind of man who expects an answer when I ask a question in my own house." His thumb grazed the edge of the bruised skin. Sophie let out a tiny, involuntary whimper. "Who?" Elias repeated. The word was carved from ice. My ex-boyfriend," Sophie whispered, the truth spilling out of her before she could stop it. The sheer exhaustion of carrying the secret broke her resolve. "His name is Dominic Russo." Elias's eyes narrowed imperceptibly. A flicker of something dark and violent passed behind his gaze, but his face remained perfectly composed. "Dominic Russo, the small-time bookie who runs numbers out of the back of that run-down auto shop in Astoria." Sophie stared at him, her eyes wide with shock. You know him?" "I know everyone in this city who breathes my air," Elias said calmly, dropping his hand from her face. "Dominic owes a significant amount of money to the Albanians. He's a rat backed into a corner." Elias paused, analyzing her cheap, worn-out shoes, her trembling hands, the despair in her eyes. "He hit you because he wanted money." It wasn't a question, but Sophie nodded anyway, fresh tears spilling over her lashes. 15,000. He said if I didn't get it by Friday, the people he owes would come for me. I don't have it. I don't have anything close to it. Elias turned his back to her, walking over to the window that overlooked the glittering Manhattan skyline. He slipped one hand into his tailored slacks. "And you thought crying over my kitchen island was going to produce 15 grand?" he asked, his tone analytical, devoid of mockery. "No," Sophie snapped, a sudden, desperate flare of anger piercing through her fear. "I was crying because I am trapped, because I work 60 hours a week scrubbing baseboards for people whose watches cost more than my life is worth. And it still isn't enough to stop a deadbeat from getting me killed." She slapped a hand over her mouth, horrified at her outburst. "You did not yell at Elias Romano. You did not talk back to the boss. But Elias didn't pull a gun. He didn't summon his guards. He slowly turned around, a faint, terrifying smirk playing at the corner of his lips. It was the look of a wolf who had just found a sheep with a bit of bite. "Sit down," he ordered, pointing to one of the velvet bar stools at the island. Sophie, trembling, did as she was told. Elias pulled a sleek, encrypted black smartphone from his pocket. He dialed a single digit and put the phone to his ear. "Leo," Elias said, his voice dropping into a register of authority that made the hairs on Sophie's arms stand up. "Take a drive down to Astoria. Grab Dominic Russo. Put him in the basement at the warehouse." Sophie gasped, half standing up from the stool. "Wait, what are you doing?" Elias ignored her, his eyes locked on hers as he continued speaking into the phone. "Tell him his debt to the Albanians is paid. But tell him he has a new creditor now, and this one doesn't take installments." He hung up the phone and tossed it onto the marble counter. "Mr. Romano," Sophie breathed, her chest heaving. "What did you just do? You didn't have to pay his debt. I can't pay you back. You just bought my problem." "No, Sophie," Elias said, walking back over to her, planting his hands firmly on the counter on either side of her, boxing her in. His dark eyes burned with an intense, unreadable fire. "I didn't buy your problem. I bought him. and I don't expect you to pay me back with money." He leaned in closer, his breath ghosting over her bruised cheek. "You're going to pack your bags tonight," Elias whispered, "because you don't work for Elite Cleans anymore, and you don't live in Queens anymore. You are going to move into the guest suite down the hall, and you are going to belong to me until I say otherwise. Understood?" Sophie sat frozen, her heart racing as she realized the horrifying, exhilarating truth. She hadn't just escaped a monster. She had just sold her soul to the devil himself. The transition from a free, albeit desperate woman to a captive asset happened with terrifying efficiency. Within an hour of the kitchen door unlocking, a sleek black Cadillac Escalade was idling outside Sophie's crumbling apartment building in Queens. Leo, the man Elias had spoken to on the phone, stood by the hood. He was a mountain of a man, with cold, calculating blue eyes and a tailored suit that barely concealed the lethal bulk of his frame. He didn't speak as he escorted her up the graffiti-lined stairwell. He simply stood by the door, arms crossed, while Sophie shoved her meager belongings into 2 worn duffel bags. She left the eviction notice taped to the door. It wasn't her problem anymore. Her problems had mutated into something far more dangerous. By midnight, Sophie was standing in the center of the guest suite in the Franklin Street penthouse. Calling it a guest suite was a laughable understatement. It was larger than her entire apartment, featuring floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a dizzying, panoramic view of the glittering Manhattan skyline. The bed was a massive expanse of charcoal gray silk, and the ensuite bathroom was walled entirely in black marble, complete with a sunken soaking tub and a rain shower. On the foot of the bed sat a small velvet box and a folded note. With trembling fingers, Sophie opened the note. The handwriting was sharp, elegant, and uncompromising, much like the man who penned it. "The uniform is in the trash. You are not the help. Wear what is in the closet. Come to the dining room at 8 a.m. She opened the velvet box. Inside rested a jar of arnica ointment, a high-end, medical-grade salve for bruising. A fresh wave of tears pricked her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She was terrified of Elias Romano, terrified of the syndicate he ran, and terrified of the ease with which he had swallowed her life whole. Yet, as she stared at the ointment, a confusing, treacherous knot of warmth twisted in her chest. Dominic had caused the bruise. Elias, a reputed monster, had provided the remedy. Sleep was a fragmented, restless affair. When 7:30 a.m. rolled around, Sophie dragged herself out of the silk sheets. She opened the walk-in closet and gasped. It wasn't empty. It was stocked with an array of designer clothing, cashmere sweaters, tailored slacks, silk blouses, and expensive denim, all perfectly sized for her. It was a stark, visual reminder that Elias Romano didn't just make snap decisions. He had resources that operated at lightning speed. She chose a simple cream-colored cashmere sweater and dark jeans, applying the arnica to her throbbing cheek before lightly covering it with makeup. At exactly 8 a.m., she pushed open the heavy mahogany doors of the formal dining room. Elias was already there, seated at the head of a long glass table, reading a copy of the Wall Street Journal. He wore a dark navy suit today, sans tie, the top 2 buttons of his shirt undone. A steaming espresso sat at his right hand. He didn't look up as she entered, but he gestured vaguely to the chair to his immediate right. Sit. Sophie sat, her posture rigid. A middle-aged woman in a crisp black dress entered through a side door, carrying a silver tray. She placed a plate of perfectly poached eggs, avocado, and toasted sourdough in front of Sophie, along with a cup of black coffee, before vanishing back into the kitchen silently. "Eat," Elias commanded, finally lowering his newspaper. His dark eyes swept over her, taking in the cashmere sweater, the jeans, and the slightly less pronounced swelling on her cheek. A flicker of satisfaction crossed his stoic features. "I'm not hungry," Sophie whispered, staring at the porcelain plate. "I didn't ask about your appetite, Sophie." "I told you to eat," Elias replied, his voice a low, dangerous purr. "You are underweight, exhausted, and running on adrenaline. You will eat, or I will have Leo sit here and watch you eat until the plate is clean. Your choice." Sophie's head snapped up, anger momentarily eclipsing her fear. "Why are you doing this? Why do you care if I eat? You basically kidnapped me, Mr. Romano. You bought my debt and forced me into your home. Am I your prisoner? Am I supposed to be your mistress?" The word tasted like ash in her mouth. Elias set his coffee cup down. The sharp clink echoed in the massive room. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the glass table, closing the distance between them. The sheer predatory focus in his gaze made Sophie want to shrink back into her chair. "If I wanted a mistress, Sophie, I would have one," he said smoothly, his tone devoid of inflection. "And if you were merely a prisoner, you would be in a very different room right now. As for my name, Mr. Romano is what the men who fear me call me. You will call me Elias." "Then what am I?" she challenged, her voice trembling despite her bravado. "You," Elias said softly, reaching out to tuck a stray lock of hair behind her ear, his knuckles deliberately grazing her jawline, "are a complication, but more importantly, you are mine to protect." Dominic Russo didn't just owe $15,000 to the Albanians. He owed something far more valuable to a man named Declan Hayes. Sophie frowned, confusion furrowing her brow. "Declan Hayes? I don't know who that is." "He runs the Irish syndicate out of Hell's Kitchen. He's been trying to breach my port operations for 2 years, Elias explained, leaning back in his chair. "Dominic wasn't just gambling away his money, Sophie. He was gambling away you." The blood drained from Sophie's face. "What do you mean?" "Your cleaning agency. Elite Cleans," Elias said, watching her carefully. "You have security clearance, keycards, alarm codes, access to the private residences of some of the most powerful people in this city, including mine. Dominic promised Declan Hayes that he could get his hands on my security protocols, and he planned to do it by beating the information out of you, or worse, handing you over to Hayes's men so they could do it themselves." The room spun. The nausea rising in Sophie's throat had nothing to do with the eggs in front of her. Dominic hadn't just hit her because he was drunk and desperate. He had hit her because she was his collateral. "The Albanians weren't coming for you on Friday," Elias continued, his voice dropping to a grim whisper. "Hayes's men were, and they don't leave witnesses. When you started crying over my marble island yesterday, you weren't just a maid having a breakdown. You were a walking liability. I had 2 choices. Eliminate the liability." He paused, letting the deadly weight of the word hang in the air. Or secure it. Sophie stared at him, her chest heaving. You saved my life. I secured an asset, Elias corrected coldly, though the intense, possessive heat in his eyes betrayed the clinical vocabulary. You are under my roof because it is the only place in New York City where Declan Hayes cannot reach you. You will stay here. You will not leave without my permission. You will not contact anyone from your old life. Do you understand? Sophie looked at the man who was both her captor and her savior. The lines between right and wrong, between danger and safety, had blurred into a terrifying shade of grey. I understand. Elias, she breathed. Elias smiled. It was a small, dangerous curve of his lips. Good. Now eat your breakfast. We have a busy afternoon ahead. 3 days passed in a haze of terrifying luxury. Sophie roamed the massive penthouse like a ghost haunting a palace. She learned the rhythms of Elias's life. He was a phantom who left before dawn and returned long after sunset, always accompanied by the silent, brooding presence of Leo. But on the 4th evening, the fragile bubble of isolation popped. It was raining, a torrential downpour that lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows. Sophie was in the library, curled up in a leather wingback chair with a book she wasn't actually reading, when the heavy oak doors swung open. Elias stood in the doorway. He looked exhausted. His suit jacket was missing, his tie was loose, and there was a dark, unmistakable smear of crimson blood on the pristine white cuff of his shirt. Sophie gasped, dropping the book. You're hurt. Elias glanced down at his sleeve with mild annoyance, as if noticing a coffee stain. It isn't mine. He walked over to the mahogany wet bar in the corner of the library, pouring himself 3 fingers of scotch. He downed half of it in a single swallow before turning to face her. The shadows in the room seemed to cling to him, amplifying the lethal aura he constantly projected. Come here, he commanded softly. Sophie hesitated, her eyes locked on the blood on his cuff, before slowly standing and crossing the Persian rug. She stopped a few feet away from him, her heart hammering against her ribs. Elias set the glass down and reached into his slacks, pulling out a small, heavy object. He held it out to her. It was a silver Zippo lighter. It was deeply scratched on one side, bearing the initials D. Dominic's lighter. Sophie stared at it, her hands trembling as she refused to take it. Why do you have this? Dominic Rousseau is no longer a problem, Elias said, his voice flat, completely devoid of emotion. He had a long conversation with Leo and myself in a warehouse in Red Hook this afternoon. He confirmed everything. He sold your security codes to Declan Hayes. Is he dead? Sophie choked out, the reality of the violence crashing down on her. She hated Dominic for what he had done to her, for the bruises he had left on her face and her soul. But the thought of a man being murdered because of her made her physically ill. Elias took a step closer, crowding her space. He reached out, his hand wrapping around the back of her neck, his thumb resting against her pulse point. It was a grip of absolute ownership, yet entirely gentle. He is on a freighter currently passing the Ambrose Light, headed for a very unpleasant labor camp in Eastern Europe, Elias stated cleanly. I don't kill in my own city unless I have to, Sophie. It attracts federal pests, but he will never set foot in New York again. He will never touch you again. Sophie squeezed her eyes shut a tear slipping down her cheek. The relief was overwhelming, toxic, and suffocating all at once. "Thank you," she whispered, the words tasting like submission. "Don't thank me yet," Elias murmured, his thumb stroking the soft skin of her neck. "Because taking Dominic off the board forced Declan Hayes to move his pieces early. He knows I have you. And he knows that as long as I have you, his men can't use your agency access to bypass my security." Sophie's eyes snapped open. "He knows I'm here?" "Yes." Elias dropped his hand from her neck, picking up his scotch. "An hour ago, 2 of Hayes' men tried to breach the service elevator in the lobby of this building. They were handled. But it means the Cold War between my family and the Irish is over. It's loud now." Panic flared in Sophie's chest. "I should leave. If I leave, they won't have a reason to target your home. I'm putting you in danger. I can disappear, Elias. I can take a bus to the Midwest, change my name." "Quiet," Elias snapped, the sudden force of his voice echoing like a whip crack in the quiet library. Sophie flinched, snapping her mouth shut. Elias set the glass down hard. In 2 strides, he crossed the distance between them, grabbing her by the shoulders. He didn't hurt her, but his grip was ironclad. His eyes, usually pools of impenetrable black ice, were blazing with a raw, terrifying fury. "Do you think I am a man who hides from a fight?" Elias demanded, his face inches from hers. "Do you think I kept you here because I wanted to avoid a war? I kept you here because you are mine, and nobody, not Dominic Russo, not Declan Hayes, not God himself, takes what is mine." The sheer intensity of his declaration stole the breath from Sophie's lungs. It wasn't love. It was something far darker, far more primal. It was an obsession born in blood and forged in the shadows of the criminal underworld. "I am the boss of this city," Elias ground out, his gaze dropping to her lips before snapping back up to her eyes. "Hayes thinks he can use you to get to me. I am going to use his desperation to bury him. And you are going to stay exactly where you are, behind reinforced steel and 50 armed men, until I return with his empire in ashes." Before Sophie could formulate a response, the heavy oak doors of the library burst open. Leo stood in the doorway. The giant man didn't look flustered, but there was a sharp, dangerous tension in the set of his jaw. He was holding a sleek, suppressed Heckler and Coke MP5 submachine gun. "Boss," Leo said, his voice a low rumble. "We have a problem. The lobby cameras just went dark. Perimeter alarms on the roof access are flashing red. Hayes didn't send 2 men. He sent a strike team." Elias didn't panic. He didn't even flinch. A chilling, predatory calm settled over his features. He let go of Sophie's shoulders, stepping back to pull a custom matte black Glock 19 from the holster concealed beneath his shoulder. He checked the magazine with a practiced, fluid motion. "Take her to the panic room," Elias ordered Leo, not taking his eyes off the doorway. "Lock it down. Do not open it for anyone but me. If anyone else tries to breach that door, they won't," Leo finished grimly, racking the bolt of his submachine gun. Elias finally turned back to Sophie. The cold, calculated Mafiaboss was fully present now, a general preparing for a slaughter. "Go with Leo," Elias commanded, his voice brokering absolutely no argument. "Elias," Sophie breathed, terrified not just for herself, but to her own horror, for him. He stepped close, wrapping a hand around the back of her head and crushed his mouth against hers. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was violent, bruising, and deeply possessive. A brand burned into her soul in the span of 2 seconds. He tasted like expensive scotch and imminent death. He pulled back, his dark eyes burning into hers one last time. "Wait for me in the dark, Sophie," he whispered. "I have a mess to clean up." The panic room was buried deep within the structural core of the Franklin Street penthouse. It was an 8 by 8 foot cube of titanium-reinforced steel, equipped with independent ventilation, a satellite uplink, and rations to last 3 weeks. To Sophie, it felt like a tomb. Leo stood with his back to the heavy vault door, his MP5 resting across his chest. He reached over to a sleek command console and flipped a switch. A bank of high-definition monitors flickered to life, displaying live feeds from the dozens of hidden cameras scattered throughout the penthouse and the building's infrastructure. "I shouldn't look," Sophie whispered, backing away until her shoulders hit the cold, Kevlar-lined wall. She was trembling so violently, her teeth chattered. "You should," Leo corrected softly, his blue eyes fixed on the screens. "You need to know what kind of man is protecting you. You need to understand the currency of this world." Reluctantly, Sophie dragged her gaze to the center monitor. The luxurious, warmly lit corridors of the penthouse she had roamed for 3 days had been transformed into a kill zone. She watched in horrified fascination as the elevator doors in the private foyer blew outward in a shower of sparks and shattered mahogany. 5 men poured into the entryway, clad in black tactical gear, armed with short-barreled rifles. They moved with military precision, Hayes's elite enforcers, but Elias was already waiting for them. He didn't fight like a man desperate to survive. He fought like an apex predator, defending its den. The cameras captured the terrifying surgical violence of the Romano syndicate. Elias and 3 of his own guards had created a fatal choke point in the grand hallway. Suppressed gunfire flashed in the dimly lit feed. Sophie watched as Elias moved through the chaos with a terrifying, predatory grace. He wasn't hiding behind his men. He was leading them. "They breached the secondary elevator shaft," Leo murmured, analyzing a side monitor. "They used a cloned master keycard. Your cleaning agency's master keycard." Sophie gasped, a fresh wave of guilt twisting in her stomach. Dominic's betrayal was currently tearing Elias's home apart. "This is all my fault. If I hadn't taken that shift, if you hadn't taken that shift, you'd be dead in a warehouse in Queens by now," Leo said flatly. "The boss chose to bring the war here. Watch." On the screen, the firefight was brief, brutal, and entirely one-sided. Hayes's men had underestimated the sheer fortifications of the penthouse. Within 4 minutes, the grand hallway was silent. 3 of the intruders were down. The remaining 2 were cornered near the library doors. Then, the feed suddenly cut to black. Sophie jumped. What happened? Did they shoot the cameras? "No," Leo said, his jaw tightening slightly. "The boss cut the feed. The defense phase is over. The interrogation phase just began. He won't let you watch this part." Time lost all meaning in the suffocating silence of the panic room. Sophie slid down the wall, pulling her knees to her chest, burying her face in her arms. Every muffled thud that vibrated through the steel walls made her flinch. She thought of the pristine Carrara marble kitchen where she had wept just days ago, now undoubtedly slick with blood. She had been drowning in debt, terrified of a small-time bookie. Now she was the epicenter of a multi-million-dollar syndicate war. It felt like an eternity before the heavy, mechanical clunk of the biometric lock echoed through the small space. The vault door hissed open. Elias stood in the doorway. The bespoke navy suit was ruined, the jacket discarded somewhere in the wreckage. His white shirt was splattered with dark crimson, and a shallow bleeding cut grazed his left cheekbone. He looked exhausted, lethal, and utterly magnificent. He didn't look at Leo. His dark, burning gaze found Sophie immediately. He stepped into the room, crouching down in front of her. He reached out, his blood-stained hands gently cupping her face, his thumbs wiping away the fresh tears she hadn't realized she was shedding. "Are you hurt?" he rasped, his voice rough with adrenaline. "No," Sophie choked out, her hands instinctively coming up to grip his wrists. "Are you?" "Elias, the blood—" "Not mine," he dismissed, hauling her up to her feet and pulling her flush against his chest. He buried his face in her hair, inhaling deeply, as if her scent was the only thing anchoring him to humanity. "It's done," Elias murmured against her temple. He pulled back just enough to look into her eyes, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a heavy, solid gold claddagh ring, a traditional Irish symbol of loyalty, but in this context, the crown jewel of the Hell's Kitchen syndicate. He tossed it onto the steel table in the center of the room. It clattered loudly. "Declan Hayes is dead," Elias stated, his voice devoid of any boastfulness. It was merely a fact. "His lieutenants have surrendered the western seaboard shipping routes to my family. The war is over before the NYPD even realized it started." Sophie stared at the gold ring, the reality of the situation crushing the last remnants of her old life into dust. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice a fragile whisper. "My agency is compromised. My apartment is gone. The police will find a gas leak explosion in the service elevator shaft of this building. A tragic accident. My lawyers are already drafting the press release," Elias said smoothly. He stepped closer, backing her up against the steel wall, trapping her in his gravity. "As for you, Sophie, I told you. You belong to me now. But I need to know if you are going to fight the cage or if you are going to help me rule the empire." He wasn't forcing her anymore. The debt was paid. The threat was neutralized. For the first time since he locked the kitchen door, he was offering her a choice. She could walk away, take a payout, and disappear into mediocrity. Or she could step into the darkness with the devil who had bled to keep her safe. Sophie looked at the cut on his cheek, at the ruthless devotion burning in his black eyes. She thought of Dominic, who had hit her over pennies, and she looked at Elias, who had slaughtered an army over her life. She reached up, her trembling fingers tracing the line of his jaw, completely indifferent to the blood staining his skin. "I don't know how to rule an empire," she whispered, a slow, devastating smirk spread across Elias's face. He leaned down, his lips brushing hers in a promise of beautiful, terrifying ruin. "I'll teach you." 48 hours later, the Manhattan skyline faded into the clouds beneath the wings of a private Gulfstream G65 taking off From Teterboro Airport, Sophie sat in a plush cream leather seat, a crystal flute of vintage Dom Perignon resting in her hand. The bruised, exhausted maid from Queens was dead. In her place sat a woman wearing a black silk Givenchy trench coat, her hair blown out to perfection, her skin flawless. Elias sat across from her, his attention focused on a tablet displaying international shipping manifests. He looked up, his dark eyes softening as they landed on her. He reached across the small aisle, his fingers grazing her collarbone before he unclasped a velvet box. He lifted a stunning vintage Van Cleef & Arpels Alhambra necklace, heavy gold and onyx, and leaned forward to fasten it around her neck. It was heavy, a physical reminder of her new reality, a collar of absolute protection, a brand of undeniable ownership. "Beautiful," Elias murmured, his knuckles brushing her jaw where the bruise had completely faded, leaving no trace of her past behind. Sophie touched the cool onyx, looking out the window as the jet banked south toward a private villa in the Cayman Islands. She had lost her freedom in a billionaire's kitchen, only to realize the cage he locked her in was the entire world. Did the dark, twisted romance of Elias and Sophie leave you breathless? If you loved this deep dive into the dangerous world of the New York syndicates, hit that like button and share this video with your fellow dark romance addicts. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss our next thrilling, real-life inspired Mafia story. What should Elias do next? Tell us in the comments.